Well, good morning. Welcome to B Cube Sunday morning. I'm Bob Brown. I'm your host, and I am just thrilled to death almost uh, over our guest today. We have Jim Wright. Hi,
Oh,
Jim. And David Gerrold was going to come on with Jim. And David he lives up in Vermont, up near that, which is somewhat close to Canada. So therefore, you know, you never know what
somewhat.
you're going to get out of Vermont.
Yeah.
But right now, this morning, we have a power outage. So David's put it on the maybe that he'll
Yeah.
make it or not.
Well,
But
we're in the middle of a storm here in the Florida Panhandle, so I have a backup wireless connection. So if my main optic line goes down, we'll see if I switch it. Then again, I live in this paranoid, weird little shitty southern town where they think that 5G is mutating their chromosomes or something. So if I have to switch to backup, it's going to be a 4G network. We'll see what happens.
well, what we planned today was a show that tapped into the encyclopedic knowledge of our two guests on science fiction over the years. This came about when I was looking up. I went and looked up on the internet. You know that classic series of tubes that exists to connect all the computers, um, and I said I'd like to get some examples of what was considered woke science fiction out of the '60s and '70s. And my first search reveal had 10 entries. Nine of them were sites that would shield me from that woke crap and give me lists of non woke books. And then one was, yeah, here's a list. But so let's talk about this,
Well,
Jim.
it's funny. I mean, like I said here pre-show before we turn everything on, and you sent me an email here. I don't know, 2 days ago. We were talking about the show, and you said things. Of course, we're sitting here without David, who wrote for the original series of Star Trek. Who it's about the most woke show of the 1960s. And continues to be incredibly progressive even to this day. Even though some of the ideas now are kind of quaint, outdated, but. I thought it was kind of funny because you'd said, and then let me read. I actually have the email open in front of me. You said, obviously, this would include Star Trek, but I don't think it was the only science fiction show to promote a more equitable future. And that made me laugh, the equitable future part, because when we talk about woke or we talk about utopian science fiction, none of those shows actually were very utopian, and that's the whole point because utopian sci-fi makes for boring sci-fi. Nobody wants to read about a society where everybody's happy and they all are equal and they all have enough to eat and a place to live. And so even in Star Trek, which Gene Roddenberry's he claims that he always claimed it was his original vision, but I think he kind of retconned that in there later on when the show became more popular, and then we got into the next generation. But it was all supposed to be post scarcity, semi utopian union where the Federation of Planets was all these weird creatures and different people. And not only were they all equal, they all had sex and weird hybrid babies. And, but the funny thing is that those shows were never about that. They were always about the inequity and the dystopian cracks around the edges. They were always about the conflict. Those Federation ships that were supposed to be explorers were armed to the goddamn teeth. I mean, they were like all battle wagons. They were called cruisers, and they all had military command structure and military ranks. And nobody ever beamed down to a planet with a phaser in hand, ready to zap the natives. And so, uh, there's utopian science fiction, and then there's actual storytelling, and it's always been sci-fi's job to promote. Well, let me back up here a second. As I said, utopian science fiction makes for boring stories, and there's a reason for that because we don't live in a utopia, even though we may want to work in that direction. And so, when you go looking for stories about this, as you said, you Google woke science fiction. Well, all science fiction, to some extent, was woke. I mean, the stuff that's worth reading. If David, I'm bummed that David's not here today, because I mean, this is the stuff that David wrote. This optimistic future, where there was more equity, where there was more diversity, where those sorts of things. And he was one of the people that wrote this stuff originally, that put it out in the mainstream. But science fiction's always been about pushing boundaries. It's about visualizing futures that are not where we live now. And uh, the one of the things, and David, again, this David was the center point of this. And I was just up in Seattle here not too long ago at a convention, and we were talking about some of the things that happened a number of years ago, specifically a group of people in science fiction that call themselves the sad puppies, and they were very sad people. And they were mostly people that are my age, in their 60s, who remember science fiction nostalgically. It as rockets and ray guns, those pulp covers with the men in the Boris Vallejo suits of armor and the women in the little metal bikinis, like kneeling at their feet with some horrible monster on the horizon. And that's what they remember. They remember Buck Rogers, the rockets and the ray guns, and they remember those as that's science fiction to them. That those stories they're very simple. The men were men and the women were women, and there wasn't a lot of ambiguity to it, and that's what they remember. But they're remembering it the way we all remember our childhood. We remember the 50s and the 60s as being a simpler time because you were children. You didn't have any responsibility. They weren't simpler times. There was complex and horrible and filled with racism and bigotry and sexism. Is the world that we live in now. If anything, this is complicated. When they look back at those times, I know people that are a bit older than I am that look back, and when you say make America great again, what do you mean? And they say, well, the 1950s, that was a wonderful time, and what they remember is that simple rock and roll, Elvis Presley and Bobby Socks and sock hops, and, going to the soda fountain, and those kind of things. What they don't remember is the Red Scare and the Korean War and hiding under their desk because the nuclear bombs might fall. They don't remember the fact that I live in Milton, Florida, one of the last towns in America where it was legal to lynch black people. Okay. I mean, there's a train station right downtown that's a museum now where there are white and colored waiting rooms, and those were in operation right up until the 1974. They don't remember that. None of us do. We remember our childhoods as simpler times. And so when people, you Google, tell me about science fiction that visualized a better future for us all, and then people are like, oh, it wasn't like that back in the day. It absolutely was. I mean, all of those classic science fiction stories that you remember, Dune. And if it's it was funny when we talked about this. I did the same thing you did. I plugged it into Google to see what the hell would come out, and the first thing I got was a Reddit forum where there were people on there that are probably in their 20s that were bitching about the fact that science fiction's all political now. It's all political. It's all politics. Right? All they talk about is politics in science fiction. They never used to do that. Science fiction used to be so much better before the politics. I'm like, well, when the hell was that? Because if you read the classic science fiction that existed before these, I mean, even Buck Rogers was political. Dune is nothing but politics. John Varley wrote about a future of post scarcity where people were booted off Earth by some vague aliens, and they lived in the nine worlds out in the universe, and people could change sex easily, and there was plenty to eat, and nobody was homeless, and all those kind of things. And yet there were still unhappy people, many unhappy. The whole society was unhappy, and the stories were unhappiness and the politics that depend from that. Larry Niven wrote all kind of things about politics. the politics of known space that drove those stories. You can go back. Ursula Le Guin. Her stories are all about politics, about galactic empires, and how I mean, these were the things. This is what science fiction does. It visualizes certain changes and how those impact how society works. And so, if everybody can read everybody's mind and there are no secrets, that changes politics. And then the story is about those changes and how they work. If people can't lie, or they can't tell the truth, or they can't. Joan Devins wrote a story about people who a world where people had lost their hearing. They couldn't hear anything, and so everything was visual. And there was some disease in some colony world, and everybody lost their hearing. And they could hear. They were. It's the story of the one-eyed guy in the kingdom of the blind, and so those people had basically magic powers. They had extrasensory perception that other people didn't have, and that changes the politics. It changes how the world works and how people see it. And so I don't know where the hell this magical time in science fiction was when it wasn't visualizing the people that are inequity and people that are disenfranchised. Even the simple stories that people remember nostalgically now. One that pops into my mind right away is Heinlein's Juveniles. Heinlein wrote a 13 or 14 juveniles for Scrivener. And these were fairly, if you read them now, they're pretty simple stories. The teenage hero is a guy. It's always a guy, and he's kind of a dumbass. And there's always a smart girl who, Heinlein based on his wife Jenny, and she's always redheaded, and she's always smarter than he is, but she's got to pretend like she's not because otherwise it hurts his feelings. And 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 science and logic rule the day, and then they figure their way out of things. And these are very simple stories. They have very simple themes, honor and integrity and telling the truth. And when the characters deviate from those principles that were important to Heinlein, they get in trouble. And that's the story. That's the conflict in the story. Well, one of the best ones, one of my favorites of his juveniles was a story. It's actually how I wound up becoming a fan of science fiction. I think I was, I don't know, 12 maybe. And I told this story in Seattle at the convention in Seattle. It was funny. They scheduled me for just a talk at like 8 o'clock at night. And who the hell goes to a talk at 8 o'clock at night at science fiction convention in Seattle? And they showed up and there's like 200 people in the room. Scared the hell out of me. I'm like, holy crap, what are these people doing here? But it asked me how I got interested in this. And I was at, I don't know, 11, 12, something like that. And we only had 3 channels of TV back in those days. And I think we only got one of them. And um, I went to the local library. I discovered books. My grandmother, they were poor, didn't have a lot of money. And my grandmother gave us books every year for Christmas. She'd been a teacher. And she didn't give us like books. She gave us the books that she subscribed to. So they were books of short stories of Reader's Digest. They don't have anymore, but it used to be these Reader's Digest condensed short stories, and they consolidate the stories from the magazine all year, and then they put out a book at the end of the year. And my grandmother always got those, and then she would give them to us for Christmas, hand me downs, and so I started reading, and at a young age, 8 or 9, something like that, and I became fascinated with it. And reading was it was amazing to me because it would transport you to other worlds. But I read westerns and things like that, and then Hardy Boys in particular. The book that really got me hooked was Hardy Boys #8, Mystery of Cabin Island, and one day I was in the library. I used to go to the library. I discovered books. I didn't have money to buy books, but you go to the local library and it was like full of books, and they would let you have them. And of course, the kids could only get books from the young person section, and so they'd let me check out 3 books a week. And so I would bring those books up to the thing, and I literally was a voracious reader, and I read everything in that damn section. And I could only find 2 books. And I was walking back up to the librarian, and there's a rack in front of the librarian's desk, this rack of paperbacks. Well, paperbacks were, those were pulps and bad things. They had lurid covers and cleavage and scantily dressed people and that sort of thing. And right in the middle of that rack was this weird greenish black book with these strange figures dancing around this odd machine. It was called Farmer in the Sky by some character named Robert Heinlein. And so on impulse, I grabbed it and I read the back of it. It was about farmers on Ganymede or some shit. And so I got to the desk. The librarian wouldn't let me have the book, and because that was not for kids. Science fiction. That's that's for weirdos. That's not for it's bad influence on children. And but I said, well, it's about farming, and we were this stuff. The background is this is farming territory, truck farming, and lettuce and tomatoes and celery, that kind of thing. And everybody that grew up where I grew up became a farmer. If they weren't a doctor or a lawyer, then they became a farmer. They made cars, one or the other. Um, and so I talked her into it. She let me have it because it had farmer in the title. And I went home and I read it, and it was like Heinlein had written that for me, man. And and the thing about it is this is a juvenile book. It's written for 14-year-old boys, and it dealt with themes like loss of a parent. The protagonist in the story, who was a 12-year-old kid, had lost his mother. She died from some kind of disease. His father remarried. He had a hell of a hard time with that. They immigrated to a moon of Jupiter. There were disasters. People died. There was hunger. The world didn't have enough calories, didn't have enough food. And then it was only many years later that I realized that story was built around Heinlein's experience in the 1930s, during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl in the Midwest. The U.S. government created a number of what were called socialist colonies, agricultural colonies. Four of them, four big ones in the United States, where they would take farmers from impoverished areas of the country where farms had failed and the Dust Bowl had ruined things, and they would move them to these colonies where they would grow produce, and that produce would be sold to a co-op that's just about as socialist as it gets. And they would be paid in script from the co-op, and they would use community tractors and community mules and that kind of thing, and they would farmstead. And if they proved those farms over 5 years, they would own that land. And the produce would then be used to feed hungry people in the United States. Well, this is the exact story of Farmer in the Sky. And it was years later, many years later, that I moved to Alaska, and I settled in a town called Palmer, which was founded as one of those agricultural collectives by people from Michigan and Minnesota, which is why everybody in that part of Alaska sounds like Sarah Palin. And because they came from Scandinavian descendants in places like Minnesota. Um, and it's funny because you walk around that town of Palmer, and in fact it's referred to as Colony, and the mountain is named Colony, and Pioneer, and that's who these people were. They were socialist collective colonists founded by the United States government in Palmer, Alaska. They were going to grow produce and ship it on ships down to Seattle, where we used to feed hungry people in the United States. And I don't know if they would have made it or not. There were 200 families that had settled there. And then World War II happened, and then they grew produce for the army, and now it's a thriving town. But the long and short of it is that even back then, when that story was written in the 1950s, Heinlein was writing poverty, hunger, equality. The shuttle pilot, the mean shuttle pilot who flew the Jitterbug, which was this shuttle that moved the colonists around the planet, was female. That's unheard of in that time. Nobody wrote about female rocket pilots. And so even Heinlein, this bastion of stodgy old conservative science fiction, was writing about subjects that nowadays we would consider woke. And in fact, we just had this conversation yesterday. It turns out that the it's part of Trump's agenda to eliminate DEI and woke and whatever bullshit they come up with this week from the United States military. They removed 900 titles from the library at the Naval Academy. Things like the biography of Martin Luther King. But one of the principal stories, or one of the principal books on the U.S. Navy's reading list, is Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. And you may have seen the movie with Casper Van Diem in the principal role of Johnny Rico. And Casper, I mean, the guy's name is literally Casper. You couldn't have a white actor than Casper. But the book, Johnny Rico is not white. You don't find that out until later in the book. You read all the way through the book, and it's only there are hints. His family speaks Tagalog, which is the language of the Philippines. But it's only far into the book that you discover that Johnny Rico, and Rico, I mean, but it's only later into the book where you discover that Johnny's not white. And that book was military science fiction in the 60s. And you can say what you want about Starship Troopers, but it was incredibly progressive for its time. The commanders of the warships were women. These were in command roles in the U.S. military, or in the military of the book, which was not something that happened anywhere in the U.S. military. Heinlein was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. And so when people talk about science fiction being woke nowadays, it's always been woke. I mean, that's literally for God's sake, what we often consider the very first science fiction story, a novel, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And you're talking about a woman who had sex with her boyfriend on her father's grave. It's kind of an odd duck, but the story itself, the novel, it's about a guy that wants to reanimate life, who goes against everything of that time. That's why the novel is still something that people read hundreds of years later, and several hundred years later, and because it was so incredibly progressive and forward thinking, and because it broke the norms of conservatism of the time. And so the books and the stories that you remember, even the ones that we claim are utopian, like The Giver, for example, that's a dystopian story, not a utopian one. They live in a utopia surrounded by disaster and ruin, and their utopia starts to crumble as soon as people are given access to their history and their past. And so you see that in a lot of you see that in a lot of stories that are considered utopian, or those sorts of things. The stories are about the stories that you remember, the ones that change the world, that make an impact, that live with you. You may remember, if you're like me and you're in your 60s and you remember stories of Robert Heinlein's juveniles from long ago. They seem simple and easy nowadays. And some of the stories that Andre Norton wrote, those sorts of things. And Norton's another one. She was a contemporary of Heinlein. Most of her greatest works were written in the 60s and 70s. One of my very favorites was the Astra series. It's two books, Starboard and Ad Astra. And Ad Astra is about a world that's devastated by nuclear war, by specifically by the Pax, which were a group of people who turned against science, who stopped believing in vaccinations, who believed that science was evil and that scientists were evil and that engineers were evil, and they took the technology of their time and turned it against humanity and destroyed the world, and then built an empire and sat on top of it, and the world became this dumbed down agrarian, society of proletarians. And it's about a group of scientists who escape from that. My God, man, it doesn't get any more woke, any more than politics, than that story. And it was written for teenagers. And so it's always amusing when you contacted me here 2 days ago, Bob, and said, "Hey, let's talk about utopian science fiction and science fiction that's woke or not woke, or whatever the hell the word is nowadays." It made me laugh because The entire genre is that way, but it's not just sci-fi. Sci-fi grew out of it stands on the shoulders of older fiction, of older genres, particularly westerns, because a lot of the original sci-fi reads very much like you're reading a western in outer space. And in fact, you and I mentioned this, although it's funny, you mentioned the show Gunsmoke right before we went live here. And as I said to you, I have, unfortunately, or last, fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know what the right word is, but um, I have had to take care of elderly relatives and ones with memory issues, Alzheimer's, for example. And that's one of the reasons I live here in the Florida Panhandle instead of in Alaska, where I thought I would spend the rest of my life. And um, as my mother-in-law's memory declined and she kind of regressed in the things that she could remember, the things that she remembered were the stories from her childhood, which Gunsmoke and Have Gun Will Travel and Laramie, and one of my favorite shows, Laramie, and Death Valley Days, and the Tales of Wells Fargo. And so we had the Grit channel on the big TV in the living room on permanently, and she watched those shows, and you can see a lot of the same themes in those shows that you see in later science fiction, which came from that. In fact, a lot of the actors, DeForest Kelly, James Doohan, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, all those people that came from Star Trek, the original series, they were all character actors in those shows. And it's funny when you see Doctor McCoy showed up as the bad guy on Laramie, or the one that really threw me was Leonard Nimoy. He was the bad guy in like every show he showed up on, and um, but the themes, especially for the time, were about racism. They were about how we treated Native Americans. They were about women having the right to vote. They were they were about solving problems with your fists and with your guns instead of with the law. I mean, if you watch, and I mentioned this to you before we started the show, one of the most progressive shows on television, and the one that older people remember fondly to this day, on the Prairie, the stuff based on the books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. But that show dealt with everything. There were episodes in there about the Jewish family that comes to town. People think that they've got the guy, he was an undertaker or something. He made coffins or some shit, and the children all thought he had horns on top of his head, underneath his hat, and there were all these Jewish tropes, and how they befriended this guy and got past that racism, that prejudice. I mean, that's some big, heavy shit. That's some woke stuff for the 1970s, right? And it's funny, as I mentioned to you, the Alison Arngrim, the woman who played Nellie Olson, which in Ingalls' story, that's a conglomeration of three or four different people that she knew as a child that she hated, that she considered bullies and stuff. And so Nellie was like this distilled, horrible character that was always the bad person throughout the entire series. Alison Arngrim is one of the funniest, smartest, hilarious people, and an outstanding writer nowadays. I've spoken to her a number of times, and she's an amazing. but but again, those stories are even those stories that you would regard nowadays, that people of a certain age nowadays look back at with nostalgia and say those were simpler times, and the shows and the entertainment and the writing was, it didn't have in it, and it wasn't about all this politics. It was about all of those things. You just don't remember it, or it fits in with your politics so well that you don't notice it. And all of those shows, if you watch shows from the 70s, like Ramp, Emergency, Sky, what was it? Yeah, Emergency, Squad 51, even the soap operas of that time were all about politics. They were about the ideas of the time. I mean, my God, what was the big one? When everybody, who shot JR, whatever the hell that damn show is, I can't remember. All those shows were that's what they were about. They were about economics and rich versus poor, and people who had and who didn't have, and And so science fiction is simply it is a reflection of that. I'm watching stuff scroll down the screen here. And let's see. Yeah. People talk about Laura Ingalls Wilder. They were great books. Um, they were. I mean, even books like Nancy Drew or the Bobbsey twins, those had themes in. I mean, those books were written in the 30s, and they had the themes of politics, greed, and avarice, rich versus poor, homelessness, anti-Semitism, those sorts of things. And yeah, Dallas, yeah, Dallas. You guys were all saying Dallas. Yeah, that's what it was. Dallas. It's been so goddamn long, I couldn't remember. And I mean, a show about rich people, right? Who'd watch that? Goddamn. But but yeah, I mean, if you look at the original shows that people remember simply, especially that again, it's a tragedy that David's not here today because this is David is one of the people who created this stuff. David is one of the guys that wrote the original series of Star Trek. And it doesn't get much more. There was a black woman in a command position on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise on primetime television in 1967. God damn. I don't know how the hell you get any more woke than that. And then we look back on that stuff and say, I wish it, back in the days when it was entertaining and they weren't all about politics. Shit, oh dear. You just had two of the most popular movies were Denis Villeneuve's remake of the first novel of Dune. My God, Dune is nothing but politics. It's entirely about politics. I mean, if you took the politics out of Dune, it'd be a show about sand. It gives a shit, right? And those, if you've actually read Dune, it is the politics of the Middle East. That I will bet you that if you're my age, the first time you ever heard is when you read Dune. And that's not an accident. The heroes of the story, or the heroes, but the people that the heroes of the story are not the heroes, but the people that you relate to in the stories, the ones that you root for, the Fremen, they're all based on Islam. They're all based on the Arab peoples, and but they never actually. The words are all Arabic, but no one ever actually comes out and says that. And these are the people that you sympathize with in the story. Yeah, somebody said Gulliver's Travels. That was in Gulliver's Travels was very much about politics. The Iliad was about politics. The stories that if you take politics and progressivism and woke out of science fiction, you're not left with a hell of a lot. You're left with rockets and ray guns and shapely girls in bikinis. And there is science fiction that is that. And if that's your thing, by all means, watch it, read it. Half the movies from the 1970s were that, you know. But even shows that were blatantly hot girls in bikinis like Barbarella were politics. That's what they were about. If you watch, if you watch even the B reel stuff, who's the guy that made God damn it, Ghostbusters? One of his first movies was a movie called Space Hunters: Adventures in the Forbidden Zone. Molly Ringwald's first speaking role. And it was about three women that are kidnapped on this ruined planet, and space hunters got to go get them back. And it's again, it's about homelessness and hunger and poverty and inequality. And this is a crappy B movie that showed at drive-ins when I think I was about 16 or so. You can't, if you take politics and you take woke out of science fiction, you're not left with a hell of a lot. But it does exist, and if that's your thing, and woke makes you mad, and politics makes you mad, well then you can go to any Worldcon, and in the back corner of the dealer's room will be a table of some really grumpy old dudes with pucks, and that's what they write. And for a very reasonable amount of money, you can buy that stuff. And if you enjoy that, more power to you, man. And if that's what you enjoy writing, then write that. But sci-fi, or speculative fiction, whatever the hell we want to call it nowadays, literally embraces the entire universe from before the Big Bang, if you read Stephen Baxter, to after, to the depth and the scope and the of the multiverse. I mean, within that framework are infinite possibilities. Surely there's room in there for rockets and ray guns and girls in metal bikinis and woke and progressivism and politics. And I'm surely somewhere within that framework you can find something that you enjoy. And again, look, I have days like that. I have days where I spend all day staring at this crap on the screen and people shout hate in my face, and I just want to go inside, turn on Netflix, and watch Chris Pratt run around, make smart ass comments with robots, and even that, the Electric State, which is on Netflix now, and even that, as goofy as that is, it's about politics. It's about inequality. It's about slavery. You know, you don't have to put up with those things. I had somebody here the other day, actually, when I was looking at this stuff, said to me, you're missing it. It's like the old day. It's like the old days, like when Star Wars came out. Star Wars wasn't political, and I'm like, did you miss the stormtroopers? Did you miss the Nazi iconography? Did you miss the rebellion against the empire? I mean, okay, yeah, Carrie Fisher in a bikini. I got that part. Okay, I realized that's all you saw. I didn't see anything else. And the guys with the blasters and for some reason the beams of light travel slower than light, and all that kind of stuff. I got that. But literally, the entire story is written about politics. And when Spielberg or when Lucas was able to Spielberg when Lucas was able to actually write what he wanted to write, then you got three movies about the empire and economic and economic war. The fourth movie literally opened, the first movie, whatever the fuck order it is, literally opens with a trade war. I mean, how relevant is that to what we're in the middle of now? And so, and that movie was all full of racial stereotypes. I mean, it raised all kind of hell at the time. I don't know how you separate politics from life, from writing. As a writer, I don't know how you do that. And so anyway, if I feel like I'm babbling on here, let's see, what do we got? Let's look down the side here. Well, you guys, oh yeah, somebody mentioned Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. Yeah, I hated that show. I watched it. My wife loved it, and I didn't hate it. There was a real fantasy, but again, one of the things about that show is it did address all the things that we're talking about: racism, inequity, anti-Semitism, hate, how we treated Native Americans, the mythology of the Old West. I mean, all of those things were part of that show. And so, and to this day, there are huge fans of that. They actually have conventions where people go and talk about it. And so it's like you said, yeah, that's actually what Miriam just said. It did an excellent job of portraying racism, misogyny, homophobia, and environmental concerns. And that's absolutely correct. Yeah. And so there's this idea that politics or progressivism or awareness or woke, whatever the hell we're calling it, is something new is bullshit. It's been with us all along. It's just that when it agrees with your ideas, you don't see it as anything unusual. And when it conflicts with your ideas, that's when it becomes something bad. But I will say to you that the original fiction, science fiction, is religion. Because, and you get mad all you want to and write me hate mail, go ahead, I don't care. But religion was originally a way to explain the universe and the things that we didn't understand. Back when supposedly there was this guy 2,000 years ago who came along, this hippie looking dude in his robe, and he told people things they didn't want to hear, like do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Feed the hungry, clothe the poor, heal the sick. Look to the beam in your own eye, not the mote in your neighbor's. I mean, any of this stuff sounding familiar? It doesn't get much more woke than that. That guy told people things that they didn't want to hear. And by definition, that's pretty goddamn woke. Not to, no pun intended. Nowadays, the 2,000 years later, the adherents of that guy's belief seem to think that what he said was just keep being an asshole, keep hating the people that you hate. You don't have to do anything else. As long as you say my name, you're good to go. And so now it sounds good to them because, as far as what they hear, is just keep being you. You don't have to do nothing. You don't have to be a better person. Hate the people that you hate. Be greedy. Be selfish. Be self centered. That's fine. And they've left all of those things out that were the part where that guy was telling people stuff that they did not want to hear. And that's very little different from the science fiction of today that says things to people that they don't want to hear. And the funny thing is that things that science fiction is saying today, or Hollywood or entertainment or certain politicians, are the exact same things that that guy said 2,000 years ago. Be decent to each other. Treat people with respect. Hungry, clothe the poor, heal the sick, do unto others. That's the same message. People didn't want to hear it then, they don't want to hear it now.
Jim,
Yeah.
I
Say
like
something.
it
For
when
God's sake, man, I need a sip of coffee. Talk. For Christ's sake. This is your show, goddammit. Get on it.
no, I just like it when I hear you bringing up that the concept of the sheep and the goats. You know,
Yeah.
the
Hey, now, we don't need to bring Hubbard into this. Yeah, okay. Yeah, all right. You got me there. Anyway, yes, yeah, exactly. It's like I said, it's the shows that are entertaining, the ones that you watch now, the ones that people are interested in. Tell me that Game of Thrones wasn't political. Go ahead. Tell me the spin-off, whatever the hell it's called, isn't political. Tell me Fallout isn't political. What is the show I watched For All Mankind, which I thought was kind of disappointing, but I like the technical aspects. So tell me that's not political. Good God, it's nothing but political. It's every topic that has mattered to our society since 1964. All right, everything from gay rights to racism to blah 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 to landing on the mission or wherever the hell they are now. I stopped watching it because it got to the point where it was kind of tedious to me. But um, I just watched Silo, and my God, what a great show! I was on the edge of my seat the entire show. But it doesn't get much more political than that. If there wasn't politics in a silo, it would just be a bunch of people living in a hole, right? You know, yes, we said everything George is ever true, and the thing is that most people just discovered George R. R. Martin when Game of Thrones came out. George has been writing since the early 1970s. In fact, I have the first four. I have this first story that he ever published, which was an analog. Began in 1976 and ran through 1977. I have those issues. I have the original ones. I have them signed by George. Um, Everything that George has ever written is political. Also, everything that George has ever written is unhappy. George has ever written his life, which to me was when Game of Thrones ended the way that it did, and people were horrified, and the person that they loved and identified with, the actress, and she went insane, and they burned the city down, and there was an unhappy, unsatisfying ending all the way around. But goddamn, that doesn't get any more George R. R. Martin. I mean, if you're just now discovering that George Martin doesn't write happy endings, I don't know what to tell you, man. That's like saying Stephen King. Stephen King writes bedtime stories for children. It just kind of made me laugh. But But the thing about Martin is all of his works are very political. If you've ever read Tough Voyaging, for example, those are 5 stories that are all, I think they're some of the best things that he's ever written, but they're all about politics. If you have ever read Night Flyers, and not those, there's been 2 crappy Hollywood adaptations, and goddamn, they were bad. And it was just hilarious because the second one, Martin was a producer on, but Night Flyers is one of the most horrifying horror stories I've ever read. It's just incredibly well put together, and it's entirely about politics. All of his stories, his short stories. If you, like I said, if you only discovered George R. R. Martin when Game of Thrones came out, you really missed it because it was actually his Federal Empire stuff before that he wrote for 30 years before that when nobody knew his name. The guy could want conventions, this little short, pudgy guy in his suspenders and his white beard, and nobody heard who the hell he was. Nowadays, he can't go out of his house without being mobbed. I think he hates it. But you know, he wrote amazing stuff. But again, it's all political. The very first story that he ever wrote was called After the Festival. It was a serial in Analog magazine, like I said, in 76 to 77. And it became his very first novel called The Dying of the Light. And it doesn't get much more political than that novel. And so, again, it was about complex gender relationships. A guy that was very popular in the 1970s, still around, a guy named John Varley, wrote some incredible stories. He's still writing great stuff, don't get me wrong. But Varley was probably the most popular author of the 1970s, and everything that he ever wrote was about politics. It was about it was you know it was about people who changed genders without batting an eye, who changed sexuality, who changed their appearance, who they were, what they were called, their names. Their Titan. But the Titan was a great story. Don't get me wrong, but his Nine World stuff, where people changed genders, they changed sexual identity, and it was like clear and complete. It was like one day you're a guy who likes women, and you walk into the shop, and they change your genetics, and you walk girls, and this was things that people that lived for a very long time in these stories did on a daily basis. And I'm sure there were people that were maybe squicked out by that, but the vast majority of people who read those stories, it was just a thing. It was just an aspect of the story. And the thing that gets me is that if you can read that in science fiction and you're like, okay, great. There's a story that he wrote, one of his very first ones. I think he was nominated for the Hugo for it, Picnic on Nearside, where the, the protagonist starts out as a as a male and becomes female, or was female and becomes male. I don't remember which way the hell it went. And you start out identifying with this character as male, and then they're female, or female, and then they're male, and it's nothing. It's just a switch you flip as you're reading along, and and Varley was very, very good about being able to visualize characters from different genders and different roles and different sexualities and different sexual orientations. And as you read along through those stories, the characters might go through all of those changes. And it was just an aspect of the story. And if you can do that in a story, why the hell can't you do it in real life? Why can't you just accept people for who the hell they identify as today? How does that affect you? How does that impact on you at all? Another one, for years, people read a guy named James Tiptree Jr., who is one of the single most famous writers of the 1970s, who wrote male characters, who is supposedly a male who wrote female characters better than anybody else. Well, of course, James Tiptree Jr. was actually a woman named Alice B. Sheldon, who was an astounding writer. She was an amazing human being. She was a artist who was an intelligence operative during the Second World War. She worked for the SAS. She did all kind of clandestine things. She became a chicken farmer after the war with her husband, who'd also been an intelligence operative. She became a writer, one of the most famous writers in the world. She was supposedly wrote as a man for many years until she was outed as a woman writer. And there were people that were really upset about that. There were book critics that were like, absolutely not. I know a man when a man writes, and I'm telling you, he's a man. And then it turned out they were wrong, and that really hurt their feelings a lot. Alice Sheldon was an amazing individual, and she had a very tragic end. And her story, there's a number of autobiographies out there about her, or not autobiographies, but regular biographies. And if you get a chance to read about that, you absolutely should do so. But again, her work was all political. It was all how most of it was written about women in the 1970s who were treated horribly and who railed against their station and worked to find a way out of it and change the universe. And again, if you can read that stuff and nominate those people for the Hugo Award, why the hell can't you do that in real life? Why can't you? What is that? Is that your dog or something in the background, Bob? Ah, okay. I was trying to figure out what the hell that was, man. Anyway, if you can do that, in reading a book, why can't you do that in real life? Why can't you look at people and accept them for who they are, who they want to be, or that sort of thing? That's the part I don't get. And so now let me look at comments here. As Bob's gone to take care of his dog, I was kind of weirding me out there. I didn't know what the. Um, oh, am I there? Oh yeah, we're back. We're in and out. So like I said, I'm
Uh-oh, Jim, are you frozen?
Am I?
Oh, you were briefly.
Yeah, like I
You're
said,
moving now.
the power's in and out. We're in the middle of a lightning storm. Like I said, it's just a here biblical.
You brought up the um, John Varley. He was one of the first what I would consider adult science fiction I read after Asimov and Bradbury, etc. But I don't want to sell the Forever War short when you talk about the.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And
I mean,
what's amazing?
for me, I grew up in Texas, and homosexuality was just one of them things. And all of a sudden, here it is. I'm reading in the Forever War, um, just straight out lays it out, and where they called him the old queer because he was still
Right,
heterosexual.
every straight guy in the army, and so they call him the old queer. If you ever read Joe's, it's getting harder and harder for Joe Haldeman to get around. But if you ever get a chance to talk to Joe Haldeman about that book if you're ever at a sci-fi convention, you get a chance to just sit and listen to Joe talk. He's a fascinating guy. Of course, he fought in Vietnam. The Forever War is not really about war. It's about his experience in Vietnam. It's about what was happening in the 1960s.
Okay, you're freezing up on there again. But I'll also tell you that Forever War, while it was a brilliant book and I loved it and I probably read it 20 times, another book from the that era that Vietnam severely impacted was Elizabeth Ann Scarborough wrote The Healer's War in that same time period. Another brilliant book that was heavily influenced by the current social what was going on in the world. Is your internet back, Jim?
Like a major thunderstorm. You should be able to hear it over the microphone here. But yeah, there are. I'm probably going to get punched out here pretty quick. But things like the early Octavia Butler.
Yeah, you want to look up anything that talks about progressive science fiction. The search will include Octavia Butler.
Yeah,
I mean, you
Ian Banks, The Culture. I mean, my God, doesn't get much more progressive than that. So, but Yeah, you're probably going to lose me here permanently here and not too much longer. So it's like I said, it's storming pretty hard here. But I mean, even books like Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. Those are you're talking about a civilization that is guided by aliens who turn out to look like devils, but are more like Jesus, and they become a post-scarcity society where their children go on to be gods. And so then you're talking that all of these things are ideas that have been with science fiction from the very beginning, from the very first novels. And these are not new ideas. Science fiction didn't suddenly become, yeah, a lot of David Drake stuff too. I see somebody say it. Drake's kind of an interesting character. His stories are, it's if you go down and read things like Hammer Slammers and those kind of things, that guy could be he could be very Jerry Pournelle-esque. And there's another one. Pournelle couldn't write anything without including politics. In fact, he's known for his political writing. But again, give me a novel that doesn't include politics. It doesn't include some aspect of DEI or woke or whatever. Come here, dog. You're all right. Sorry, she's not scared of thunder, but she's not happy about it either. So she likes to be down here. But if you read the modern stuff, we talked about old science fiction. There's a lot of modern stuff, a lot of stuff that's being written today that is political, but it's incredibly entertaining. It's as good as anything that was ever written in the genre. And these are people like John Scalzi, who writes a lot of his stuff is political, but it's written in a humorous vein. Or Robin Cowell writes incredible stuff. Her Ladies Astronaut series is fantastic. Of course, N.K. Jemisin. If you're not reading that, I don't know what the hell you're doing watching this podcast. But there are guys that are not as well known. The guy named Carl Schroeder from he's a Canadian. He wrote a series called the Virga series. It's a post scarcity, utopian sci-fi. Though there's nothing utopian about any of it. And Lady of Mazes. There's all kind of. Just pick up the Schroeder book at random and read, and you're good to go. And yeah, and I see Michelle said John Scalzi's a genius. I don't know about genius, but he's up there. He's a hell of a nice guy too, and a hell of a writer. Scalzi's the people often say that Scalzi's a writer's writer. That's not true. He's a publisher's writer. He's the guy that if you're an editor or publisher that you want to write for you because he writes very fast. He writes very good. He writes the stuff that people want to read. And um, but I mean, you can't go wrong reading any. There are 1,000 people in this genre nowadays that are writing stuff that's worth your time to pick up and read, and that are writing. I mean, yeah, they're writing about politics, but science fiction has always been about politics. They write about what it's like to be. Again, here's the thing: I don't want to read stories that are about old white guys like me. I got that. I
Okay.
live in that skin. I don't need to read stories about that.
See, I serve one purpose. I have something to say when Jim freezes.
I don't know if I'm frozen or not. I can't tell. So, um, am I still there? Hello?
Oh yeah, you're still here. I'm
I,
just
I, was, I, was,
I'm the JD Vance to your John Don Trump.
oh God, just stop talking. But I would say to you, if you're looking for, I'll give you two stories.
Peace to you too. I
Well, I'm in and out. I want to talk about science fiction. Written
Okay, guys. As much as
by
I
Greg Bear called Hard Fought, and it's about
much as I love having this brilliant encyclopedia that was let out of its pod long enough to do this show, uh, I got to say this. Thank you, Jim, so much. Not only for showing up today to give us this uh, lesson in just a deep look into your brain, but just thank you for the daily pictures of. I mean, what you do with a camera and birds is brilliant, and what you do with a keyboard when you're writing your blogs is equally brilliant. And we thank you both, you and David Gerrold, and we know that he would have been here had it not been for those evil Canadians cutting off their power. Um, he had a power outage.
Hey,
But any closing thoughts, Jim? It looks like you're back. The Thunder's.
okay, well, good. Hopefully, we're past here. Yeah, like I said, I'm going to punch out here, and I've got about 90 pounds of wet dog in my lap at the moment. But um, I would leave you with two things. If there's two definitive stories that I would leave you with, those are a story called by Greg Bear called "Hard Fought." It's about a war that lasts for a million years. It's about how that war changes society and how the people who fought it became exactly like their enemies. And it's an incredible short story. Bear was a genius writer. Um, and I can't recommend that short story enough. Again, Hard Fought, Greg Bear. And the other one is Nova by Chip Delaney, Samuel Delaney. Chip doesn't write much sci-fi these days, but he is an incredibly brilliant writer, an amazing thinker, a hell of a human being. And when you read things like Nova, which was written in the early 70s, it still holds up today. It's like it was written today. It's one of the most incredible novels I've ever read. Um, it's entirely about politics, but it's the kind of politics that science fiction is based around. And it's worth every second of your time. It's hard to find nowadays, but if you get a chance, again, Nova, Samuel Delaney, and Hard Fought by Greg Bear, those are stories that they tell you about war and politics, about inequality, about people that are different than you are, and how you can see things from their very complicated, very human viewpoints. And so, like I said, I highly recommend those stories. So, anyway, as I said, I have 90 pounds of wet dog in my lap at the moment. And that's, I wish that was a euphemism for something, but it's not. And so I should probably let you go. And thanks for having
Well,
me.
thank you, Jim. And remember, the best way to avoid conflict is, as we found out with, um, is to always is with Lilliputians, is to always crack your eggs the right way. And
That might be a euphemism for something.
only some of you are going to get that. But
Yeah.
thank you, Jim. And I'm going to let you guys all go. And